Why are some countries rich while others struggle not only to make ends meet, but also feed their people? What if the answer isn't wars, resources, or policies, but something as simple as dirt? This video is building upon my previous video, Why Most of the World is Poor, which you can check out linked in the description and in the pinned comment if you so wish. But watching that video is not required in order to understand this one. In that previous video, we mentioned all the various reasons why inequality and poverty exist. And in this video, we are zooming into a deeper exploration of one particular reason, and that is soil. This video is part of a series of videos explaining economic inequality throughout the world and the factors influencing it. However, most of these factors that we will cover individually, such as soil quality, navigable waterways, and culture, etc., are not deterministic. That is to say, they explain the initial differences in civilization and wealth development in history, but they are by no means inherent and unchangeable, as all societies can rise in and out of wealth and poverty, just as history shows. There are economic systems and policies that make any society richer when implemented, which we will also cover in this series in the future. So, returning to the topic, how can soil be that big of a deal that I can claim that it makes some countries rich and others poor? Well, human society begins with agriculture, and the type of soil that ancient humans had access to had a great influence on the type and quality of food that they had access to. Fertile soils can produce enough food to feed not just those farming the soil, but also produce a surplus that can feed even more people. This surplus of food is the key to civilization because it allows for other individuals to dedicate their lives to something other than agriculture and become artisans, builders, scholars, or traders. Without a surplus of food, there is no specialization and there is no division of labor. And so, a civilization where all members are just growing enough food to sustain themselves are effectively locked out of the opportunity to advance further because all of their time is used up in merely surviving. Basically, civilizationally speaking, it's not just about feeding people, it's about freeing people up to innovate and build something greater. And obviously, not all soils are created equal. Around the world, the quality of soil varies drastically, shaped by a mix of climate, geography, and history. For example, soil along certain rivers like the Nile in Egypt or the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia were incredibly fertile thanks to regular flooding of those rivers that replenishes nutrients in the soil. These regions became cradles of civilization, supporting massive populations and allowing for the rise of ancient empires. Compare that to the soil of the Mongolian steppe or the rugged highlands of the Andes. These areas supported much smaller populations, and it took thousands of years longer for civilizations to emerge there than they did in the former examples. This is neither the fault of the Mongolians or the Incas, but it is a feature of the land they found themselves born on. To better understand what exactly we are talking about here, let's talk about the specific types of soil found throughout the world. One of the best types of soil that a nation can be blessed with is the Chernozem, or black earth, or sometimes referred to as black gold. This soil is thick, rich in organic matter and nutrients, and ideal for cultivating grains like wheat, corn, and barley, and are often thought to be twice as productive as less fertile soil under similar conditions. These soils are found in Ukraine, southern Russia, and the United States Midwest, and they make these regions insanely agriculturally productive. And if you've ever wondered why Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe, it is because of these black soils that allow Ukrainians to grow gigantic quantities of wheat to export to Europe and the rest of the world. Then we have andisols, also known as volcanic soils, as I will call them for the remainder of this video. These are the soils formed from ancient volcanic rocks that surface during volcanic eruptions from deep within the ground. What's interesting about these soils is that they are absolutely packed with minerals that are necessary for crop growth, such as phosphorus, potassium, calcium, iron, and magnesium, and even more. They also retain water exceptionally well, which is great in dry regions. If you've ever played Civilization 5 and then wondered why a volcanic eruption improves the fertility of your land, it's because the game is trying to simulate the depositing of new nutrient rich volcanic soil onto the land after an eruption. These soils can be found in India on the Deccan Plateau and Argentina's Pampas region, which are one of the reasons Argentina has massive potential for agriculture. There are also volcanic soils throughout the Pacific Ring of Fire and even in parts of the United States, such as Texas and Oklahoma. These soils can stay fertile for very long periods of time as long as they aren't mismanaged too badly and allow for nations that cultivate them to grow to feed massive populations. Just as an example, the island of Java in Indonesia, which is full of these soils, manages a population of 151 million people, which is more than the entire population of Russia at 143 million, the largest country in the entire world. While Java is only a little bit bigger than Bulgaria, a country of only 6 million people. To any Bulgarians watching this video, imagine if your country had and grew enough food to feed 150 million people. That's the power of these soils. Then we have the soils that arguably started civilization itself, the alluvial soils. These soils are the cradles of civilization, and they are found in river valleys and floodplains because they are created by rivers depositing silt, sand, and clay full of nutrients and minerals during floods. If your people are located near floodplains or a large river, and better yet, if that river floods on a regular interval, that can be predicted and accounted for, like the Nile of Egypt, then boom, you have yourself an early civilization. Floods might seem bad on the surface, but each flood leaves behind a fresh layer of nutrient rich soil, which is, again, perfect for growing grains and sustaining a large population. Even with alluvial soils, not all rivers are created equal. Let's compare the Nile with the Tigris and Euphrates of the Fertile Crescent. Obviously, both of these regions are cradles of civilization, but Egypt developed a far greater ancient civilization than those of the Fertile Crescent, and this can be explained almost entirely by the rivers and the soil that the local people had access to. The Nile River flooded on a highly predictable annual schedule, delivering nutrient rich silt to the valley in a consistent and manageable way that meant that Egyptian farmers could plan their agricultural cycles reliably and produce a stable and consistent amount of food, avoiding famines. On the other hand, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were far less predictable. They could flood at inconvenient times, too early or too late in the year, and could often ruin large harvests. This volatility made farming more difficult and required greater effort to manage. As we've already mentioned, less food in ancient times means less people, less labor division, and thus less civilization. We will talk about this more in the next video of this series about rivers and navigable waterways. The next type of soil we're going to talk about are the loess soils. They're quite a different story. These soils are created by the wind as it carries fine particles of sediment from one geographic location to another over thousands of years, which settle into thick layers and create the loess soils. These soils are light, easy to work with, and also very fertile. The prime example for the impact of these soils is the North China Plain, where they have supported farming for millennia and allowed the Chinese civilization to thrive and prosper, holding the spot for the richest society on Earth for more than 1,000 years. But they are also found in other places, such as in Europe in the Danube River Valley. These soils have a big disadvantage, though. Loess soils are a double edged sword. On one hand, they're incredibly fertile, making them ideal for agriculture and the birth of civilizations. On the other hand, they're extremely fragile, prone to erosion by wind and water if they aren't carefully managed. To understand loess soil, we have to picture it. It's not like the heavy, sticky clay soils or compacted solid earth. Loess is light, silty, and almost powdery, built up over thousands of years by wind-blown dust, often in areas where glaciers once ground rock into fine particles. It's the very lightness that gives Loess its richness, but also its vulnerability. It doesn't hold together well, and it erodes quickly when exposed. That's the trade off. Take the already mentioned North China Plain. For centuries, it was basically a land of opportunity for the Chinese, and farmers rushed to this region because of the fertility of its soil and the ease of farming it. You didn't need any advanced irrigation systems, techniques, or sophisticated tools, and the yields were great. However, over generations, the forest and vegetation that held the soil in place was stripped away for farming and firewood, and the fine soil was washed away with the rains, carving gullies into the local hills, and the farmland turned into a barren landscape. The soil then piled up downstream into the Yellow River, silting it so heavily that floods became a regular disaster and earning it the nickname China's Sorrow. But this isn't just something that happened in ancient history, it happened recently as well. Take the Dust Bowl in the United States in the 1930s. The Great Plains of the United States were covered in the same light, fertile soil that could be found in China, and the American farmers took full advantage of this. They plowed up the native grasses to plant wheat, but what they didn't anticipate is that the roots of these grasses anchored the soil, preventing the harsh environment from eroding it. Without the grasses, strong winds would blow it away, and that would be made even worse during droughts when the soil would turn to dust, carried by the wind that would bury entire farms. Low S soils are fertile soils that must be managed very carefully. Another important soil type are the alpha soils, which are found in temperate and tropical regions with a distinct clay enriched subsoil and boast a moderate high fertility. They can be slightly acidic, but with correct soil management can be turned very productive. They are located in parts of Europe such as Germany and France, in North America in the Corn Belt, and in the African savannas, as well as in India and Southeast Asia. As you probably can guess, they form under forested or savanna ecosystems and are found in temperate and tropical regions with a distinct wet, dry climate. These soils are characterized by their already mentioned clay enriched subsoil, which retains nutrients better than many other soil types, and a relatively neutral to slightly acidic pH. Alpha soils are fairly fertile compared to most other soil types. They have a high base saturation, meaning that they hold more nutrients essential for plant growth, such as calcium and potassium. This makes them excellent for growing staple crops like wheat, corn, and soybeans, as well as more diverse crops like vegetables and fruits. However, alpha soils are not as inherently rich as volcanic soils or the black earth Chernozem. Their productivity depends on sustainable farming practices to prevent nutrient depletion, which is why European agricultural productivity jumped when they discovered crop rotation, for example. Moving on to the tropics, let's talk about tropical soils, or oxysols and utisols, like those that can be found in the Amazon rainforest. One would think that regions such as jungles and rainforests that are so lush and green would have incredibly fertile soil. However, the opposite is true. These soils are very nutrient poor and not very productive at all. This is because nutrients in the soil are often washed away by heavy rains, but the ecosystem has figured out a way to deal with this. In the humid and hot conditions of rainforests, organic matter that falls on the ground, such as leaves or branches or anything else that might die, decompose incredibly quickly, and the rainforest plants absorb them even quicker. The roots of these plants are often very shallow, and they spread just beneath the surface to catch said nutrients before the rain washes them away. This creates an interesting situation where virtually all of the nutrients that are located in a rainforest ecosystem at any given time are located in the biomass itself, in the plants and trees, not in the soil. That's great if you're a rainforest plant, but not so great if you're a human society looking to start a civilization. This often doomed humans living here to a permanent state of tribalism, never really developing beyond these primitive systems. Though there are isolated examples of humans beating this limitation, like the Mayas of Central America. The Mayas figured out how to create fertile soils of their own called terra preta, which they enriched with charcoal, organic matter, and various minerals manually. This soil was incredibly effective and fertile, so much so that it's still fertile today, hundreds, if not thousands, of years later. Another soil type found in the tropics are red and yellow soils. They are formed in warm and wet climates where, again, many nutrients are leached away. But the difference between these soils and regular tropical soils is that these soils are rich in iron and aluminum, giving them their distinctive colors. Like tropical soils, they don't seem very fertile, but with the right techniques, they can grow certain crops such as millet, sorghum, or coffee pretty decently. It all depends on the ingenuity of the farmers farming them. Red soils are found throughout the world, in southern and eastern India, in the Australian outback, and in large parts of Kenya and Tanzania, in the southeastern United States and Brazil, while the yellow soils are found in Southeast Asia, Japan, parts of Colombia, and Ecuador, as well as West Africa. So, how is it that farmers manage these soils to make them productive? Firstly, they add organic waste compost to the soil to enrich it with nutrients. They plant crops like clover or legumes, which are then plowed into the soil to add nitrogen, because these crops take their nitrogen from the air, not the soil. And then, in more modern times, farmers use NPK fertilizers and micronutrient supplements as well as add lime to raise the soil pH. To prevent erosion, some cultures terraced their farms, especially in hilly areas such as that of India and China. And trees are planted alongside the edges of farms to create windbreaks and prevent wind erosion. With some of these measures, red and yellow soils can be turned decently fertile, especially for specific crops that thrive in them. Then, moving back into the temperate climates, we can find podzols, which are acidic, nutrient poor soils most often covered by thick forests. These soils are very common in places like Scandinavia, Russia, and Canada. As you can imagine, they aren't great for farming, but they are great for harvesting high quality wood, which is why all of the aforementioned places have thriving forestry industries and have had them for centuries. Unfortunately, this also means that early civilizations did not crop up around here whatsoever, because the tribal communities relied on hunting and fishing rather than large scale agriculture to survive. And last, and maybe least, we have the desert soils, also known as arid soils, which are dry, sandy, and basically devoid of organic matter. They are often saline and or alkaline and can be found in the American Southwest, the Australian outback, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. They are virtually useless for farming, though there are some rare exceptions where some peoples have managed to make it work with strong irrigation systems and copious amounts of fertilizers, like parts in the Middle East and especially Israel, where people grow crops like dates and melons very efficiently. To understand how large of a difference different soil types can really make, let's compare France and Mongolia. France is home to some of the most productive soils in the world, including Chesserzem in the northeast, alluvial soils along its river valleys like the Seine and Luri, and alpha soils in the temperate regions. These fertile soils allowed France to become an agricultural powerhouse early in its history, enabling the growth of a large, stable population. These fertile soils supported diverse agriculture, allowing the French to grow wheat, barley, grapes, olives, and other crops, which in turn fueled trade and wealth accumulation. The steady agricultural surpluses allowed for by these soils laid the groundwork for France's rise as a political and economic power. Food surpluses meant people could specialize, leading to advanced craftsmanship, commerce, and eventually industrialization. The soils were fertile, but just unfertile enough to force the French to invent and adapt various new methods of soil management and ways to increase their agricultural productivity throughout their history, leading to an even bigger population as time went on. By the 13th century, France was the nation with the biggest population in all of Europe. This all gave France the ability to field very large armies, develop some of the biggest cities in Europe, and invest in infrastructure like roads and canals, which all had a compounding effect on the French civilization. With such agricultural surpluses and somewhat predictable yields, France could also weather periods of crisis such as the Napoleonic Wars without collapsing. Now let's contrast France with Mongolia, which, unlike France, is dominated by arid soils, Poor and dry soils that combined with her cold climate, low precipitation, and short growing season make Mongolia far from a farmer's paradise. In fact, they make large scale agriculture virtually impossible. Without fertile soil to sustain large scale farming, Mongolian society historically relied on nomadic pastoralism. The economy, if you could call it that, consisted of herding sheep, goats, horses, and camels, which were suited to the steppes' sparse vegetation. While this lifestyle was in touch with nature, as some would describe it, it didn't allow for the accumulation of agricultural surplus, which is key to supporting a complex and thriving economy. The harsh soil and environment shaped Mongolia's nomadic culture. The need to move constantly in search of grazing land and water fostered a society that prized mobility, resilience, and adaptability. Mongolian cuisine, heavily reliant on dairy and meat, reflects the limitations imposed by the land. Even their social and political systems, like the decentralized tribal structure, were shaped by the land's inability to support dense, sedentary populations. This made Mongolians a military people because they were forced to fight each other for good grazing land and migration routes. Over time, they perfected warfare and conquest, and it was all unleashed onto the world under Genghis Khan, who united the Mongolians and turned them from each other out against the world, creating the largest continuous empire the world has ever seen. Still, though, these conquests did basically nothing to improve Mongolia long term, as the limitations of the harsh soil and environment prevented Mongolia from truly prospering up to today. Through examples like this, we can truly see how large of an impact something as basic as the type of dirt a country is sitting on can have on its wealth, economics, and history. France's fertile soils allowed it to support a dense population, which in turn led to the growth of cities, specialization, and cultural flourishing. Mongolia's poor soils and arid climate limited its population density, keeping communities small and dispersed. We cannot expect equal economic outcomes from two nations so different as France and Mongolia are, precisely because they are so different, and the resources they had access to were so different, and the soil is just one of these resources. As we explore different factors that predict wealth, geographic or cultural or otherwise, we begin to realize that expecting economic equality between nations or peoples is virtually impossible, and that has, in fact, historically never been the norm. The agricultural productivity of France provided the foundation for economic diversification. From food production to textiles to industrialization, France had the resources to develop a multifaceted economy. In contrast, Mongolia's resilience on herding animals for basic survival made any kind of meaningful economic growth impossible up until very recently. Soil quality not only impacts agriculture, but also creates a ripple effect through a nation's economy, history, and culture. France's fertile soils set the stage for its wealth and power, while Mongolia's poor soils dictated a more modest trajectory. Neither path was inevitable. Human ingenuity, trade, and other factors played their parts, but soil set the starting conditions. And that is really something I want to hammer home. While soil is a factor that explains a way society develops economically, historically, and sociologically, it is by no means set in stone. While soil seems like something unchangeable, it really isn't. There are many examples of human going against the cards that were dealt by nature and shaping their destiny to be far better or far worse than it would have been had nature been allowed to choose. Think of it this way: a soil type is one of the cards that society is dealt when the game of humanity began, but all societies played their cards differently. And as I keep adding videos to this series, we will explore all the cards and all the ways of playing. Individual farmers often improve their own soil in various different ways, some more and some less effective than others. For example, many organic farmers who avoid pesticides and chemical fertilizers often divide up their land and rotate its use between growing crops and feeding cattle. A piece of land might be used to grow tomatoes one season, and then the next is used for cattle to graze on. That way, the manure from the cattle is used to replenish the nutrients taken up by the tomato plants, restoring and even improving quality of soil year over year. Barren land can be turned into prime grazing fields by using a rotational grazing system, where cattle completely strip a piece of land of all its grass before being rotated to a different piece, allowing the previous to regrow grass higher with the help of manure left behind by the cattle, and so on in a cyclical pattern. Just like a farmer who carefully manages his own soil will over time have a higher quality soil, so will a nation of people who do the same compared to others who do not. We can take Japan and India, for example, as two nations who started with vastly different soil fertility levels historically, but they flipped the script on each other over time. India has historically been blessed with some of the most fertile soils in the world. The alluvial soils along the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers, the black soils of the Deccan Plateau, and the red soils of southern India supported one of the earliest and most enduring agricultural civilizations, the Indus River Valley Civilization. These soils allowed India to produce large surpluses of crops like rice, wheat, and cotton. And of course, that meant that India, from very early on, had one of the largest populations in the world. However, the people of India didn't manage their soil all that well, and over time, a lot of the fertility was lost. Since the Indian population was expanding rapidly, large chunks of forests were cleared out for agricultural use. This might seem like a good thing initially, but this exposed the soil to wind and water erosion, stripping away topsoil and reducing its quality. India also experiences large seasonal rains during the monsoon season, which usually help with farming. In this case, eroded the soil even faster. Indian farmers often planted large monocultures of high yield staple crops like wheat and rice, which by itself doesn't seem like a problem. But when you repeatedly plant the same crop on the same soil for years without crop rotation, you will deplete the soil of essential nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. Basically, you will experience short term gains, while every subsequent yield will be smaller and smaller than the last. Indian farmers also heavily relied on pesticides and chemical fertilizers, which also have a negative effect on the soil when overused, as they disrupt the soil's natural microbiome and lead to salinization in many areas, ruining the soil for the future. Then compare this to Japan, which historically had far less fertile soil than India, but today the situation has reversed. Much of Japan has acidic soil that is poorly suited for agriculture without some kind of human intervention. And that, coupled with Japan's mountain terrain, meant that it wasn't really a farmer's paradise. The Japanese farmers were incredibly industrious, and so they dealt with these issues very efficiently. Firstly, they adapted to the mountainous terrain by creating terraced fields, which prevented the soil from eroding with rain and allowed them to irrigate it far more efficiently. They also mastered the art of using green manure, which are plants specifically grown to then be composted into the soil to enrich it. One of the most well known examples is soybeans, which were historically grown because they are nitrogen fixers. Basically, instead of taking their nitrogen from the ground, soybean plants take it from the surrounding air. Then, the plants are composted into the ground, effectively adding all the nitrogen taken from the air back into the ground, enriching the soil. Japanese farmers also practice crop rotation and polyculture, as opposed to monocultures often found in India. They rotated between growing rice and barley on their land as an example, and also utilized companion planting, which is when you plant multiple crops together that either take different resources from the ground and thus don't compete with each other, or one plant repels the plants that eat the other. When it comes to India and Japan today, the tables have turned. Japan's soils were once considered poor and are now highly productive thanks to centuries of careful land stewardship. Meanwhile, India's soils, once among the most fertile in the world, are degraded from overuse, erosion, and chemical dependence. This reversal demonstrates how soil isn't set in stone. It is a dynamic resource, and human actions, both good and bad, play a huge role in its trajectory. Nations that invest in sustainable soil management can overcome natural disadvantages, as seen with Japan, while those that exploit their soils without regard for long term health risk losing this vital resource, as seen with India. As we have demonstrated, a nation's economic and social trajectories are literally grounded in the dirt beneath its feet. And this lone factor can explain to us why some nations are where they are, even today. The idea that every country should achieve the same economic outcomes ignores the widely uneven playing field created by environmental and cultural factors of a people, soil being just one of them. How can we expect equal results when the resources a civilization starts with are so different? Some lands, like France's fertile plains, provide the perfect launch pad for abundant agriculture, population growth, and eventual industrialization. Others, like Mongolia's arid steppes, make large scale agriculture virtually impossible, and by extension, the development of densely populated, specialized societies. Expecting equal economic outcomes in a world of such diversity is like expecting two runners in a race to cross the finish line together when one started on flat ground and the other started on a steep incline. The conditions simply aren't the same. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, as more than 99% of you watching this are not subscribed, and it would help me immensely in continuing to make these videos for you for free. Also, be sure to share your thoughts with me in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.